I was in a boarding school when I was 4 years old. I was taken away from my mother and my grandparents. I think the most important thing that I remember, and it's been with me all these years, is the fact that I was taken away from my parents. My mind has never let me alone one day without thinking about 300 miles from my home. I ran away from that school 6 times, and each time that I was caught, I was beaten. There was absolute loneliness by everybody that was there, all the young kids. And every night there was crying. You could hear kids crying. Even my crying was amongst them. Any child that went through this terrible social experiment of taking children, native children, and bringing them and putting them in these schools, and trying to make Christians, make us believe in Christianity, and making us forget the native ceremonies that we attended, make us forget the languages and the songs. I think any child that goes through that will forever be filled with trauma.
The federal government began sending American Indians off to reservation boarding schools in the 1870s, when the United States was still at war with Indians. An Army officer, Richard Pratt, founded the first of these schools. He based it on an education program he had developed in an Indian prison. He described his philosophy in a speech he gave in 1892. A great general has said that the only good Indian is a dead one, Pratt said. In a sense, I agree with the sentiment, but only in this, that all the Indian there is in the race should be dead. Kill the Indian in him and save the man. 50 years later, Pratt's philosophy was still common. In 1945, Bill Wright, a Patwin Indian, was sent to the Stewart Indian School in Nevada. He was just 6 years old. Wright remembers matrons bathing him in kerosene and shaving his head. Students at federal boarding schools were forbidden to express their culture, everything from wearing long hair to speaking even a single Indian word. Wright said he lost not only his language, but also his American Indian name. I remember coming home and my grandma asked me to talk Indian to her, and I said, "Grandma, I don't understand you," Wright says. She said, "Then who are you?" Wright says he told her his name was Billy. "Your name's not Billy, your name's Talrum," she told him. And I went, "That's not what they told me." According to the head of the American Indian Studies program at the University of Arizona, the intent was to completely transform people inside and out. Language, religion, family structure, economics, the way you make a living, the way you express emotion, everything. Lorna Wyma says, from the start, the government's objective was to erase and replace Indian culture, part of a larger strategy to conquer Indians. Meanwhile in Canada, a similar program was taking place. This is from the CBC. In the 19th century, the Canadian government believed it was responsible for educating and caring for Aboriginal people in Canada. It thought their best chance for success was to learn English and adopt Christianity and Canadian customs. Ideally, they would pass their adopted lifestyle on to their children, and native traditions would diminish or be completely abolished in a few generations. The Canadian government developed a policy called aggressive assimilation to be taught at church-run, government-funded industrial schools, later called residential schools. The government felt children were easier to mold than adults, and the concept of a boarding school was the best way to prepare them for life in mainstream society. Residential schools were federally run under the Department of Indian Affairs. Attendance was mandatory for children in the many communities that didn't have day schools. Agents were employed by the government to ensure all Native children attended school. Initially, about 1,100 students attended 69 schools across the country. In 1931, at the peak of the residential school system, there were about 80 schools operating in Canada. There were a total of about 130 schools in every territory and province except Newfoundland, Prince Edward Island, and New Brunswick, from the earliest in the 19th century to the last, which closed in 1996. In all, about 150,000 First Nation, Inuit, and Métis children were removed from their communities and forced to attend the schools. Residential schools were established with the assumption that Aboriginal culture was unable to adapt to a rapidly modernizing society. It was believed that Native children could be successful if they assimilated into mainstream Canadian society by adopting Christianity and speaking English or French. Students were discouraged from speaking their first language or practicing Native traditions. If they were caught, they would experience severe punishment. Throughout the years, students lived in substandard conditions and endured physical and emotional abuse. There have also been convictions of sexual abuse. Students at residential schools rarely had opportunities to see examples of normal family life. Most were in school 10 months a year, away from their parents. Some stayed all year round. All correspondence from the children was written in English, which many parents couldn't read. Brothers and sisters at the same school rarely saw each other, as all activities were segregated by gender. According to documents obtained by the CBC, some schools carried out nutritional experiments on malnourished students in the 1940s and 50s, with the federal government's knowledge. When students returned to the reserve, they often found they didn't belong. They didn't have the skills to help their parents and became ashamed of their Native heritage. The skills taught in the schools were generally substandard. Many found it hard to function in an urban setting. The aims of assimilation meant devastation for those who were subjected to years of abuse.
In the name of the Father, Amen. Our Lady of Good Studies, pray for us. Our Lady of Good Studies, pray for us. Our Lady of Good Studies, pray for us. In the name of the Father.
Not sure we'll ever get a final answer, but I'm absolutely convinced the number is much higher, perhaps as much as 5 to 10 times as high as that. It's because the records are so poor. They just didn't bother keeping track of children who died.
So much horror and terror went on. When I think about the propaganda, it just, it's really, really painful when you know what actually occurred and when you know the impact in your family of what actually occurred and what you've lost because of it.
That's where a lot of my whole life really started to change, because I got strapped, I got beaten up for speaking my own native tongue. I even had my tongue pulled out and pinched,
My strongest memory there is when the little girl died beside me. She must have been about 6. I was scared why the parents were not there. That's what I was scared about. And I knew they wouldn't feel comfortable for not being there when their daughter is dying.
And do you know why they weren't there?
They were never notified.
Indian children in the residential schools die at a much higher rate than in their villages. But this does not justify a change in the policy of this department, which is geared towards a final solution of our Indian problem. Duncan Campbell Scott, Deputy Superintendent of Indian Affairs.
No one knows for certain how many children died in Canada's residential schools. Estimates usually range from 4,000 to 6,000. However, Justice Murray Sinclair, who led the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, says the federal government stopped recording the deaths around 1920 because of the alarming rate that children were dying. It's estimated that about 150,000 children were taken from their families and indoctrinated in these schools over the course of about 130 years. These schools were sponsored by the government, but often run by religious institutions. In Canada, the Roman Catholic Church operated 3/5 of the residential schools, the Anglican Church 1/4, and the United and Presbyterian churches the remainder. Children were often abused both physically and sexually, degraded, and forced to live in harsh, overcrowded conditions. Children were particularly vulnerable to diseases such as tuberculosis, and they often suffered from malnourishment. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission has estimated that children in Indian residential schools had close to the same odds of dying as Canadians serving in World War II, and that's only counting the roughly 6,000 confirmed deaths. The number of children in the US who suffered in these boarding schools is even harder to find, since no official numbers have been released. However, it's fairly safe to say that the numbers in the US would be much higher than in Canada. In Canada, there is thought to have been approximately 139 residential schools in total operating in Canada, and 80 at the same time during their peak. but in America there were somewhere in the range of 330 to 500 boarding schools. Canada had approximately 150,000 children enrolled in their residential schools, but according to the Native American Rights Fund, there were still 60,000 Native children enrolled in boarding schools in 1973 alone. Shannon Q was able to find this graphic that outlines many of the schools that were in operation, along with which religious denomination ran those schools. Of the 332 schools, 112 were run by religious organizations, and most of those were run by the Catholic Church. The rest were run by the government. According to Statistics Canada, Aboriginals are lower in almost every conceivable metric that you'd be likely to care about if you wanted to live happily. The Inuit have the lowest life expectancy, while the Métis and First Nations are not far behind. Their median income lags far behind that of non-Aboriginals, and to say they're overrepresented in custody and community programs is an understatement. While Aboriginal people represented 3.1% of all adults 18 years of age and older as of 2006, they represented 18% of all adults admitted to federal custody. Suicide rates are also astronomical. According to a 2000 report, suicides among First Nations youth aged 15 to 24 was about 5 to 6 times higher than non-Aboriginal youth in Canada. In America, the picture looks no less bleak, according to a Washington Post article. But the silence that has shrouded suicide in Indian country is being pierced by growing alarm at the sheer number of young Native Americans taking their own lives, more than 3 times the national average, and up to 10 times on some reservations. A toxic collection of pathologies, poverty, unemployment, domestic violence, sexual assault, alcoholism, and drug addiction has seeped into the lives of young people among the nation's 566 tribes. Reversing their crushing hopelessness, Indian experts say, is one of the biggest challenges for these communities. The circumstances are absolutely dire for Indian children, said Teresa M. Pooley, the chief judge of the Tulip Tribal Court in Washington State, and a member of the Indian Law and Order Commission. Pooley fluently recites statistics in a weary refrain. 1/4 of Indian children live in poverty versus 13% in the United States. They graduate high school at a rate of 17% lower than the national average. Their substance abuse rates are higher. They're twice as likely as any other race to die before the age of 24. They have a 2.3% higher rate of exposure to trauma. They have 2 times the rate of abuse and neglect. Their experience with post-traumatic stress disorder rivals the rates of returning veterans from Afghanistan. There's little doubt that these boarding schools played a large role in contributing to these alarming statistics. Canada has an Indian Residential Schools Resolution Health Support Program in place, which offers counseling and various support programs, which I'll link in the description box below. I'm not sure if there's a similar program in the United States. If you're watching this and know of one, please leave a link in the comment section and I'll add it to the description box. Thank you for watching, and thank you to Shannon Q and Duke Bonanza for helping me compile some of the statistics used in this video.